inviting me here today is that better? To talk about the article that titled Vaishnavism, Anti-Evolutionism and Ambiguities, Revisiting ISKCON's Darwin Skepticism, that Tom, my PhD supervisor, and I had published in the Science Religion journal ISKCON last year. So when I first started to research this topic, I was under the impression that ISKCON is quite uniformly opposed to evolutionary theory. And this assumption was very strongly confirmed in the small amount of academic literature on ISKCON evolution discourse. But when I looked more closely, I noticed that scholars hadn't yet considered some of ISKCON's most recent publications, or even aspects of ISKCON's founder, Prabhupada. In these texts, much of what I observed still pointed to conflict, but I also found that some ISKCON authors had made cautious, tentative attempts to accommodate evolutionary science. And surprisingly, I even found evidence of this in the material by Prabhupada, who's usually depicted as fiercely opposed to evolution. So in our article, we argue that these layers of complexity actually problematize terms like Vedic creationism and anti-evolutionism, which are commonly attributed to ISKCON as a whole. So only a few scholars have explored ISKCON's quite extensive engagement with science, and so far they've focused especially on conflict. In the 90s, Mikhail Rostein compared science-religion discourse in ISKCON and Transcendental Meditation, and argued that ISKCON views science as a fundamentally malevolent system that leads away from the religious truth, while emphasizing its own teachings at the exclusion of all foreign concepts and social systems. Though Rostein himself saw common ground between ISKCON beliefs and evolutionary theory, he concluded that ISKCON has by no means tried to make use of these structural resemblances. In a 2002 article, C. Mackenzie Brown considered the parallels between Christian creationism and ISKCON's often screamingly explicit anti-evolutionism, arguing that both groups dismiss evolutionary science as an atheistic religion and draw upon supposedly anomalous fossils in order to validate religious conceptions of biological history. On Prabhupada, Brown says that he remained inexorably opposed to Darwinian evolution and was convinced that any theory of organic evolution undermined or even contradicted the notion that the universe and all its parts, including all species of life, were created by Krishna. And more recently, in a comparative study of 3 American new religions, Benjamin Zeller observed that ISKCON throughout the 60s and 70s adopted a strongly anti-science position, openly rejecting Western science and calling for its replacement with an idealized Vedic science. Several of ISKCON's recent publications actually epitomize the anti-evolutionism that these scholars have described. 2 examples are the 2009 book, Rethinking Darwin, A Vedic Study of Darwinism and Intelligent Design, by the devotee Leif A. Jensen, who's also the chairman of the Danish Society of Intelligent Design, and the 2010 book, Nature's IQ, Extraordinary Animal Behaviors That Defy Evolution, by the Hungarian devotees Balázs Honyansky and István Tazi. Interestingly, both of these books draw extensively from anti-evolutionists from outside of ISKCON, with Rethinking Darwin including entire chapters by the leading intelligent design theorists Michael Behe, William Dembski, and Jonathan Wells. By dovetailing these intelligent design arguments with ISKCON's own teachings, Jensen constructs what he describes as an alternative paradigm derived from the Vedic literature, and Honyansky and Tazi state categorically that in the Vedic view, evolution in the way people understand it today never took place. Some more examples can be found in a 2009 edition of Back to Godhead, where the well-respected devotee scholar Urmila Devidasi, who's also written a guidebook for education in ISKCON, published an article titled Education and Evolution, a look at the influence of evolutionary theory in modern education. Also reflecting the work of non-ISKCON anti-evolutionists, she argues that the mechanistic processes of evolution diminish human value and meaning, and lead to an array of harmful consequences like materialism, atheism, and competition for resources. She concludes that evolutionary theory is opposed to the mode of goodness and is actually a dangerous idea to teach to young, impressionable students. In the same edition of Back to Godhead, an article titled Hare Krishna Statement on ISKCON's 200th anniversary appeared with an authorization from ISKCON's governing body commission. This official statement once again echoed arguments from prominent intelligent design theorists, and after blaming Darwinism for economic, environmental, and food crises, called for the leaders of society to promote divine creation as a justified and rational alternative to evolutionary theory. But among these oppositional responses, some ISKCON authors have also made cautious attempts to identify common ground between Vaishnava theology and evolutionary theory. One example is the 2005 book Life and Spiritual Evolution by Bhaktiswarup Damodara Swami, which suggests that all life forms exist in a subtle state, either manifested or unmanifested within a cosmic plan, and appear on Earth at various stages in order to fulfill the physical requirements of souls. He rejects the notion of purely random genetic mutations, but doesn't seem to oppose the evolutionary mechanism itself. In fact, he suggests that the spiritual paradigm of Vedanta could integrate the Darwinian paradigm, provided that the concept of a soul is still accepted. Another example is found in the work of Chaitanya Charandas, whose 2017 podcast on his website, The Spiritual Scientist, discusses ISKCON theology in relation to three different definitions of evolution: adaptation and variation within species, the transmutation of species, and an all-explaining ideology that can be applied to every facet of life. For Chaitanya Charan, the first definition is entirely compatible with ISKCON's sacred scriptures, because he says it's been known since Vedic times that material nature is constantly changing. He expresses some doubt about whether the second definition, transmutation, has been fully proven, but says he's willing to accept this notion if the evidence is there, and he doesn't see any contradiction between transmutation and Vaishnava theology. In this regard, he cites Krishna's statement in the Bhagavad Gita, "Under my supervision, material nature undergoes various transformations." And in reference to the Bhagavad Purana, he adds that evolution is talking about what happened on Earth, and the Bhagavatam is talking about a completely different level of existence. That's why they need not contradict. He says, by Krishna's arrangement, the species appeared at various places, and then on Earth they could have come by the mechanism of evolution. Though Chaitanya Charan considers the first two definitions unproblematic, he states that the third definition, evolution as a universal ideology, is entirely incompatible with Vaishnava theology. Not only does this concept threaten belief in God, he says, but it's also empirically and logically unsubstantiated. Interestingly, he points out that Prabhupada was only ever really presented with this ideological atheistic definition, and this invites one to wonder, had Prabhupada been more exposed to neutral accounts of evolution, if he may have actually agreed with Chaitanya Charan's overall conclusion that ISKCON does not have to be at war with evolution. So these examples, which are only a sample of recent ISKCON evolution publications, seem to indicate that ISKCON is not a homogeneously anti-evolutionist movement, despite some authors, both inside and outside of the movement, continuing to present it as such. But now, in the last few minutes, I'd like to consider how these variegated perceptions compare with those of ISKCON's founder. So in Prabhupada's published works, our references to Darwinian evolution are actually quite few and far between, but there's still some fairly consistent themes. For example, in Easy Journey to Other Planets, in the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, he claims that Darwin's theory is not a new idea because Vaishnava scriptures have already described how the living entities in different forms evolve one after another. In the fourth canto of the Bhagavatam, he outlines an evolutionary process with Krishna developing different types of bodies and impregnating material energy with souls, and then he concludes that Darwin's theory is incomplete because there's no acceptance of the living entity as spirit soul. later in the 4th canto, he claims that evolutionary scientists can't explain how the gross body is changing because such changes are connected to the activities of the subtle body, which are produced by the soul and are guided by the supersoul. In The Science of Self-Realization, he says that human life is attained after many millions of years of evolution, and life began with the aquatics, for we can understand from the Vedic literature that at the beginning of creation the entire planet was merged in water. And in the transcripts that were later developed into Life Comes from Life, alongside some more provocative statements, Prabhupada would often adopt a fairly moderate approach. For example, to the notion that life emerged from chemicals, he simply questioned where from those chemicals developed, and then answered that the explanation is Krishna. So in each of these examples, it seems that Prabhupada's main concern was not whether a process of evolution took place, but whether modern theories actually deny the existence of God and the spirit soul. But paradoxically, Prabhupada would also sometimes claim that all forms of life are simultaneously created. This view, which seems to contradict his other statements, became the crux of a conversation with Shama Sundradas, in which Prabhupada responded to various evolutionary perspectives with arguments for both simultaneous creation and attempts to reconcile his theology with modern science. For example, when Shamasundara described natural selection, Prabhupada replied that natural selection, that law is made by Krishna. On biological mutations, he said, this shows nature is working, but Darwin is unable to explain how nature is working. And regarding chance variation and adaptation, he protested only to the notion of randomness, retorting there's no such chance. Our question is, who has made these circumstances for the existence of different animals? Behind nature's law, he said, there's a brain, and that brain is God. But repeatedly, Shama Sundara asked Prabhupada how he could accept these evolutionary notions and simultaneous creation. And Prabhupada responded with an array of creative metaphysical explanations. At one point, he argued that all species have always existed, but not necessarily on Earth, but rather in some realm of material nature, and they manifest on Earth at certain points in history according to higher principles. To illustrate this, he said that the form of a lungfish appeared on Earth when a normal fish desired to survive without water. So the species of lungfish already existed in some realm of the Puranic cosmos, but it manifested on Earth in order to accommodate the living entity's desire to adapt to its environment. Many of Prabhupada's statements in this conversation and elsewhere suggest that he probably didn't have a very comprehensive understanding of evolution or a consistent response to it. But for the purpose of our article, what we found noteworthy is that he was willing to try to reconcile evolution with Vaishnava theology when his disciple petitioned him to do so. So, in conclusion, scholars like Brown and Zeller have correctly pinpointed a prevalent Darwin skepticism in ISKCON, and much ISKCON evolution material supports this view, but a small number of prominent ISKCON authors have also produced media that's much more accommodating towards evolutionary theory, and Prabhupada himself often seems more nuanced or ambiguous in his critique of evolution than he's often depicted to be. Though he did fiercely oppose atheism and often claimed that Vaishnava scriptures contain higher or more spiritually complete knowledge than modern science, it seems that his primary concern was not whether evolution actually occurred, but that Krishna is always recognized to be behind the functioning of the natural world. In a way that's somewhat characteristic of his entire Western mission, he seemed willing to entertain a variety of approaches insofar as they facilitated his central theological message that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So overall, these layers of complexity, both past and present, seem to problematize terms like Vedic creationism and anti-evolutionism that scholars have so far tended to attribute to ISKCON as a whole. Thank you.